Now it's time for today's perspective on the programme. Between 2012 and 2016, the rebel-held district of Damascus, Daraya, faced a debilitating siege from the Syrian authorities. The people who lived there had 4 years without power, proper access to food or medicine, and an intense aerial assault that killed many and forced the population to live underground to survive. The humanitarian situation was dire as Bashar al-Assad continued his attempts to stamp out, as he put it, the terrorists. Now, despite the suffering endured by the local people, though, one thing kept them going. It was not military retaliation, but the construction and operation of an underground library, fighting back, if you like, with the hope of words against the violence. Well, the story of that library has now been recounted in this book. Here it is, Les Passeurs de Livres de Daraya, une bibliothèque secrète en série, or in English, Daraya's Book Savers, a secret library in Syria. And its author, who's Middle East correspondent of the Figaro newspaper as well, Delphine Minoui, is with me here on set. Thanks very much for coming in and talking to us today. First of all, just tell us how you came about this story in the first place, because it was almost an accident, wasn't it?
It was indeed. It was back in 2015. I was surfing on the web and I bumped into this Facebook page called Humans of Syria. And my eyes were captured by a picture. It was a picture of two guys surrounded by walls of books. It was a very dark room, no window, no door. And those guys were reading books. And I took a look at the caption, and it was just mentioned that it was a secret underground library in the middle of Daraya. And to me was like so extraordinary to have some people reading books under the bombs in this besieged city of Daraya that I was following up back then. So I tried to get in touch with those librarians, trying to figure out what was the story behind this picture. So through Facebook, WhatsApp contacts, WhatsApp messages, we finally managed to get in touch, which was really difficult since they were facing a shortage of electricity, internet was not working so well. But by talking to them, I discovered this amazing story behind this library, because it was not a library that was existing during the system of Bashar al-Assad. It was a library that they decided to build from scratch, with books, thousands of books that they managed to collect from the destroyed houses in the whole city of Daraya. And in a total, they managed to gather 15,000 books.
And to tell that story, I mean, you thought about trying to get there, didn't you? But that just wasn't possible.
I definitely considered getting into Daraya because as a journalist, you need to be on the ground, you need to fight also the fake news, you need to fight the propaganda from the regime. Unfortunately, it was impossible to get there. First of all, it's really hard to get an official visa from the Syrian regime, because it would involve me going first to Damascus, to the regime-controlled area, to be able to reach Daraya, which was controlled by the rebels. But the city was also totally besieged. So even if I had a visa, I wouldn't have been able to enter Daraya. The city was totally locked from the outside world. So the only way to tell the story was to try to work as almost as a detective. You know, you get different pieces here and there. You try to build up sort of a puzzle, bring together different pieces to be able to get as close as possible to the truth, to what's going on inside the city.
And of course, Bashar al-Assad, though, I mean, he calls the people terrorists, doesn't he? And you had that doubt, didn't you, about whether you should be almost putting a positive spin on what was happening?
Indeed, it was at a time when we only had one narrative. That was the narrative of the Syrian regime, trying to convince everyone that those guys were terrorists, jihadis, carrying weapons in the name of Islam. But by talking to those guys, of course I had doubts, but by talking to those guys, months after months, years after years, it was a very long process, I reached the conclusion that those guys, how can they be terrorists when books and words are their own weapons? Those guys were reading self-help books, Stephen Covey, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. They were reading The Alchemist of Paulo Coelho. They were reading political science books. Sometimes when we were talking over WhatsApp or Skype, they were asking me about new references, about European democracy. They were asking me questions about the history of the French Revolution. When the bomb attacks happened in Paris on the 13th of November, I will always remember that day. I was back in Istanbul. I opened my email account, and the first message I got was from Ahmad. Ahmad was the co-founder of the library, and he was expressing his solidarity for the French people who were the victims of violence and terrorism like them.
You mentioned Ahmed. I mean, you kind of formed a relationship, didn't you, with 4 or 5 different people, and they told you about what it was like in Daraya and some of the terrible things that were going on there.
It was hell. It was really hell on earth. They were facing shortage of everything: water, electricity. The hospital was destroyed. They had to create an underground hospital. There was no school. So they had to start from scratch and do everything on their own. At the same time, when they were facing daily constant bombings, barrel bombs, sometimes 80 bombs per day. Can you believe that? It's like, it was the toughest, now retrospectively we can confirm that it was the toughest siege, the most violent siege of all over Syria during the Syrian war. By the end of the siege, they were also attacked by napalm. And of course, in 2013, when gas attacks occurred in the surrounding of Damascus, those guys also endured chemical attacks.
And in the end, there was a truce, wasn't there? And most of those that you've been in contact with managed to escape.
Unfortunately, I mean, it was like an ultimatum. It was die or surrender. Die from hunger, die from bombings, die from everything. So they had to surrender. They only had 24 hours to prepare a very small bag and to get into buses. And they were sort of deported to northern Syria in the province of Idlib. And it's around 300 kilometers far from their city of Daraya. And Daraya now is a total ghost town. What's very sad and what's very ironic is actually, what happened in Daraya happened a few months later in Aleppo. It happened in Homs. It happened in East Ghouta recently. And it's happening as we are talking right now in Dera, which was the symbol of the revolution, the symbol of the peaceful revolution of 2011. So no one drew any lessons from what happened. And when I talked with those Daraya activists, who for most of them are now in exile in Turkey, where I live, they feel betrayed somehow. They feel abandoned. They feel no one managed to do anything for them, including the UN, who could never afford and manage to enter Daraya except for 2 times to bring help, medical supplies and food to the people of the city.
OK, well, it's good to hear about the book, hear about the stories in it. Here it is in French. If you can read in French, you can find it already, and it's going to come out in English as well, probably next year, isn't it? You were just telling me just a few moments ago. Delphine Minoui, who's Middle East correspondent at the Figaro and author of the book as well. Thanks very much for coming in and talking to us here on France 24.